It started with a list. A quiet decision tucked inside a Washington memo. 36 nations banned from U.S. entry, including 25 from Africa. But one name stood out in red: Nigeria. For decades, the world has moved freely across African soil, drilling, extracting, shipping. But now, when the same Africa knocks on the world's door, it's told no entry, no visas, no welcome. So Nigeria answered, not with a plea but a principle. If you ban our people, don't expect our minerals. Because beneath that red clay lies cobalt, lithium, niobium, the very veins of tomorrow's economy. And suddenly, a line was drawn. Not between continents, but between values. This isn't about immigration anymore. It's about dignity, reciprocity, a question that should haunt any nation with a conscience. If you don't want our students, why should you keep our soil? If you've ever believed in fairness, not just for one nation but for all, subscribe. Because what you're about to hear won't air on your nightly news. Officially, the reason was security. That's what the document said. That's what the press repeated. But there were no new terror threats, no waves of visa fraud, no humanitarian crisis, just a list, sweeping, cold, and unmistakably targeted. 25 African nations, engineer students, researchers erased from the queue without explanation. At the center, Nigeria, Africa's largest economy, its most populous nation, a country with more PhDs per capita than many European states, a nation with more startups than France. Why ban them? Because power doesn't like independence. And Nigeria had begun acting on its own terms, partnering with China to build refineries, signing bilateral deals outside the dollar, consolidating control over the rare earths beneath its feet, minerals. America desperately needs to build electric cars, AI systems, solar grids, and missile defense networks, from cobalt in Congo to lithium in Burkina Faso. Africa isn't just a supplier, it's the nerve center of the 21st century. But instead of respect, it got restrictions. Instead of dialogue, it got dismissal. And this wasn't an isolated error. It was a pattern. Over the years, Africa has been invited to summits and forums, always as a guest, rarely as an equal. Deals are struck in Washington and Brussels, then flown in like gifts. But now those same partners are closing their gates. Perhaps they didn't think Africa would respond. Perhaps they thought silence would continue, that no one would notice another snub in a long line of snubs. But this time, Nigeria didn't send a complaint. It sent a warning. Because when the richest continent in natural resources stops asking for access and starts demanding respect, the rules of engagement change. And the powers that once dictated those rules suddenly look nervous. Nigeria didn't draft a protest letter. It didn't call for meetings or appeal to the kindness of old allies. Instead, it did something far more jarring. It flipped the terms of engagement. If you close your borders to our people, the foreign minister said plainly, then don't expect free access to what lies beneath our soil. It wasn't a threat. It was a principle, one the West hadn't heard in a very long time, and certainly not from Africa. You see, in Washington, the power game has always relied on silence. The kind of silence that lets trade flow without questions, that allows companies to mine without oversight, that assumes Africa will never say no. But this generation of Africans doesn't speak that language anymore. When Nigeria spoke, the world took notice, not because it shouted, but because it spoke with leverage, the kind that can't be sanctioned or silenced. Because the minerals in question, cobalt, lithium, niobium, are not optional. They are not luxuries. They are the lifeblood of modern civilization. Your electric car doesn't move without African earth. Your smartphone doesn't light up. Your drone doesn't fly. Your missile doesn't launch. Your solar panel doesn't store a single watt. And Nigeria knows it. In the old world order, a country like Nigeria would have issued a statement, maybe called it unfortunate, and moved on. But not this time. This time it responded like a nation aware of its power, aware of its role, aware of its worth. It wasn't just defiance, it was design. For decades, the West has operated under the assumption that Africa is a place of need, of lack of dependence, the place you help, the place you send aid, the place that's always a few steps behind. But what happens when that narrative crumbles? What happens when the continent says, "We've watched your markets rise on our minerals. We've seen your economies grow on our exports. We've listened to your speeches about partnership, even as you locked us out of your borders. And now, we're done asking." That was the tone. Not hostile, but final. Nigeria didn't just close a door. It opened a new chapter. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't about visas. It was about voltage, about supply chains, about semiconductors and sovereign rights. Because here's the thing, if you deny a person entry, they feel rejected. But if you deny a nation's minerals, the world feels it. Markets shudder, corporations panic, governments pick up the phone. And that's exactly what happened. Silicon Valley analysts began flagging potential disruptions. Mining companies called emergency meetings. Defense contractors scrambled to model alternate supply routes. Because this wasn't just a standoff. It was a collision between old entitlement and new authority, between historical assumptions and modern clarity. Nigeria wasn't begging for access. It was reminding the world what access really means. Access isn't a visa. It's lithium in your battery. It's graphite in your data center. It's tantalum in your satellite. And access, like trust, must be mutual or it won't last. Let's pause here. Imagine if America were told that it could no longer export its corn or its aerospace parts or its pharmaceuticals unless its immigration policy met foreign standards. How would it respond? Would it call it blackmail? Would it call it ungrateful? Would it call it economic war, because that's the framing that came next? Think tanks and editorial pages suddenly warned of resource weaponization. As if Africa had pulled a trick. As if asking for reciprocity was a dirty move. But that framing misses the point entirely. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about value. For generations, Africa was told to be grateful. Grateful for investment, for loans, for grants. But no one ever said thank you for the cobalt. No one thanked Congo for the coltan. No one thanked Nigeria for the niobium. No one thanked Mali for the gold. The world said trade, but what it meant was take. Until now, what Nigeria did was bold. But it wasn't rash. It was measured, calculated, moral. Because what kind of world demands minerals from nations whose children can't get visas to learn? What kind of order expects resources without respect? What kind of civilization builds its future on the backs of people it refuses to welcome? The old system says, extract the earth and exclude the people. But Nigeria's reply was simple: not anymore. This is the moment that shook complacency. Not because it came from the most powerful military or the richest GDP, but because it came from the ground, from soil that has been dug and drained for centuries. This time, the ground spoke. And when the ground speaks, even empires must listen. They said it was about security. They always say that. When the US blacklisted 25 African nations from entry, they used the oldest word in the diplomatic playbook: security, a word vague enough to justify anything, flexible enough to mean nothing. No details, no evidence, just a phrase stamped across entire populations. And yet no one asked the obvious question. Security from what? From Nigerian scholars, Ghanaian engineers, Ethiopian PhD candidates, Burkina Faso students with full ride scholarships. This wasn't about threats. It was about thresholds. Thresholds of independence the West never expected Africa to cross. Because beneath that visa ban was something older, quieter, and far more strategic: fear of a continent rising. Let's speak plainly. Nigeria wasn't punished because it was unstable. It was targeted because it was getting stable on its own terms. Because it had begun refining its own oil, building infrastructure without IMF blueprints, signing currency deals that didn't touch the US dollar, hosting mining summits that didn't invite Western intermediaries. It was the same playbook used against Burkina Faso when it expelled French troops. The same suspicion that shadows every African nation that dares to say we'll develop without permission. And when you zoom out, a pattern emerges not of chaos, but of coordination. Visa bans, investment slowdowns, aid delays, credit downgrades. Not because of failure, but because of autonomy. Because in the global order as it stands, an obedient Africa is a quiet Africa, a sovereign Africa. That's a problem. Ask yourself, why do leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso face smear campaigns the moment they nationalize mines? Why does the global media warn of instability when countries break from IMF mandates, but not when those same mandates collapse hospitals and schools? Why are African students punished with blanket visa bans while Western companies enjoy open access to their land? This isn't coincidence, it's choreography. Because control doesn't always come through bombs. Sometimes it comes through bureaucracy, through closed embassies and strategic concerns, through silence dressed as policy. But the silence is cracking. Nigeria's response exposed more than a grievance. It exposed the architecture of modern extraction. The minerals don't leave Africa by accident. They leave because the system is built that way, from colonial railways still in use, to trade deals that ban value, added processing, to banks that penalize regional currencies. Every link in the chain was designed to keep Africa shipping out raw materials and buying back the finished product at 10 times the price. And for decades it worked, because no one asked why. Until now. Now Nigeria asks, if we're not welcome in your airports, why should our minerals build your servers? Burkina Faso asks, why send gold to Paris when we can refine it at home? And millions across the continent ask, why are the children of Africa blocked from classrooms in the very countries that drain their classrooms of resources? What you're witnessing isn't chaos, it's clarity. And clarity is dangerous to any order built on denial. Because when the truth stands up, it doesn't knock, it walks in. The truth is that Africa is tired of being mined and dismissed, tired of being invited to summits, but not to decisions, tired of being told what development looks like by the same powers who profited from its underdevelopment. And now Africa is doing the one thing empires fear most, coordinating. Across West Africa, governments are talking about joint mineral policies, pricing access and processing, handled not individually, but as a bloc, not a slogan. A strategy. If you isolate one of us, we respond as many. This isn't a wish, it's already happening. In mining forums, in trade ministries, in quiet memoranda passed between Lagos and Ouagadougou, Accra, and Bamako. Because Africa has learned something old powers hoped it never would. That leverage isn't just in the earth, it's in unity. And here lies the great irony. In trying to shut out Africa's people, the West may have opened the door to something far more powerful, Africa's collective voice. A voice that doesn't beg. A voice that doesn't wait. A voice that's done asking for a seat and has begun building its own table, one refinery at a time, one visa denied, one deal rejected, one alliance strengthened. What began as a U.S. travel ban has now become something else entirely, a mirror. And it's forcing the world to answer, are you partners or are you gatekeepers? Because Africa is watching. And this time, Africa has receipts. The ink had barely dried on the visa blacklist when the ripple began. At first, it was quiet. Just a flicker in the commodities market, the price of lithium ticked upward. Then cobalt. Then niobium. Then came the calls. Boardrooms in California. Brussels and Tokyo filled with tense voices. Questions once theoretical were now urgent. What if Nigeria suspends export permits? What if Burkina Faso joins? What if West Africa coordinates? Because minerals don't sit in warehouses. They move. And when they stop moving, the future stutters. Smartphone launches get delayed. EV production slows. Solar panel contracts fall through. And the world remembers too late that its most advanced technologies begin in the earth beneath Africa's feet. But this isn't just about tech. It's about tempo, momentum. Modern supply chains rely on predictability. Raw materials must flow like clockwork. And when they don't, the entire system lurches. That's what began happening. A battery plant in Michigan halted production for a week, customs issues, the press release said. A solar company in Spain downgraded its forecast. In Silicon Valley, developers quietly revised timelines, not because of labor shortages, not because of inflation, but because they couldn't source niobium, the metal that strengthens heat, resistant alloys in missiles and supercomputers. Behind closed doors, the question became harder to dodge. What if Africa simply stops shipping? The answer wasn't panic. It was recalibration. Because while Washington focused on policy, Beijing moved on opportunity. In less than a month, Chinese delegations quietly visited Lagos, Accra, Ouagadougou. Not with lectures, but with logistics. Offers to build refineries, train local engineers, move minerals through regional ports. India followed. So did Turkey. Even Russia, long dismissed in West African trade, offered alternative transit routes bypassing U.S. tide shipping channels. The game had shifted, and America wasn't just behind, it was boxed out. Why? Because the U.S. misread the moment. It saw immigration. Africa saw insult. It thought exclusion was strategy. Africa understood it as provocation. Because let's be honest, what does it mean when you say, we'll take your cobalt, but not your children? What happens when you build your future on materials from a continent whose people you won't even grant entry to? That contradiction isn't sustainable, and investors knew it. Wall Street began whispering what diplomats wouldn't say aloud. Will African partners trust us now? What about the optics? Are we still the preferred ally? The optics mattered because it wasn't just minerals that were being questioned. It was intent. America had spent years branding itself as Africa's development partner. But how do you partner with someone whose passport you ban? In Lagos, the backlash wasn't just political. It was personal. University students staged teach-ins. Professors in Ghana wrote op-eds with titles like, "If you want our lithium, respect our lives." And from Nairobi to Bamako civil society, groups began calling for visa reciprocity. If you ban us, we ban you. It wasn't just a political protest. It was moral clarity. Because in the 21st century, no nation can preach inclusion while practicing exclusion. And yet here we were, tech companies begging for rare metals from people their governments had just barred from entry. The irony wasn't just cruel, it was unsustainable, and it pushed Africa to think differently. In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré doubled down on mineral sovereignty. Africa is not for sale, he reminded the world. The country opened its first gold refinery, expelled foreign miners who refused transparency, and began stockpiling strategic reserves. In Niger, a plan emerged for a regional mineral exchange. In Nigeria, talks began for domestic battery assembly. The message was unmistakable. Africa will not just dig, it will build. And that's when the true consequence landed. Not in market prices, not in lost contracts, but in a new strategic reality. Africa no longer needs to ask. It can walk away. From deals, from donors, from one-sided partnerships, because it knows now what it should have always known, that the world doesn't move without African soil. And no policy, no blacklist, no travel ban can unlearn that truth. If you're watching this from Atlanta, Detroit, or Dakar, understand this. Nigeria didn't just respond. It recalibrated the conversation. What we witnessed wasn't an outburst. It was the visible edge of a far deeper shift. Africa has moved from protest to policy. For years, the language of resistance in Africa was reactive. Marches, rallies, petitions. Protests after loans were signed, after troops arrived, after mines were seized. But something has changed. Today, from the mineral belts of the Sahel to the trade corridors of the Gulf of Guinea, African nations are starting to play by a different script. Not the one written in Geneva, not the one drafted in Brussels, but one rooted in control over what matters most: resources, rules, and narrative. And here's where Ibrahim Traoré enters the frame. What Nigeria declared through diplomacy, Traoré had already enacted through governance. Quietly, determinedly. In less than 2 years, the young captain from Burkina Faso did what few dared: expelled French troops, nationalized key mining assets, ordered foreign mining CEOs arrested for underreporting profits, reallocated gold revenue directly into local energy infrastructure, built a state-run gold refinery on African soil for African benefit. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't write open letters. He acted. Traoré's model was simple. Even radical sovereignty is not a slogan. It's a system. While Nigeria responded to being locked out, Traoré responded to being sold out by decades of contracts that gave everything and demanded nothing. And across the continent, that blueprint is spreading. Mali followed suit. Niger joined the rejection of ECOWAS, broke from French military control, and asserted mineral sovereignty. The AES alliance, comprising Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, emerged as more than a political bloc. It became an economic firewall. No more raw exports, no more loophole contracts, no more development assistance that starts with minerals flowing out and ends with debts flowing in. This is the realignment many in Washington didn't see coming. They were focused on coups, headlines, instability. But behind that noise, a strategy was maturing, not in Washington war rooms, but in village councils and state ministries in Ouagadougou, Bamako, Abuja. And now, Nigeria, the continent's heavyweight, is entering that alignment, not ideologically, but pragmatically. Because here's the hard truth: Africa has tried every Western prescription. Structural adjustment, deregulation-free, market extraction, foreign aid, and still the continent remains the richest in minerals and the poorest in margins. So the question becomes, what hasn't been tried? The answer: Africa. First, economics. Sovereignty over supply chains, ownership of refineries, transparent contracts, domestic processing, cross-border alliances that don't need Paris or Washington to validate them. And that's what this moment is about. Nigeria's stand wasn't just defiance. It was a signal that even the most diplomatically cautious African powers are losing patience. They've watched how the world treats Ibrahim Traoré, paints him as a dictator, blames him for chaos, warns investors to stay away. And yet on the ground, Burkina Faso farmers have electricity for the first time. Rural clinics are being restocked. Schools once gutted by IMF imposed austerity are being rebuilt with gold revenue the state now controls. Is that chaos or a challenge to the global status quo? Traoré's critics ask why he distrusts foreign capital. But a better question is, why shouldn't he? For every dollar that enters Africa through development, 6 leave in illicit capital flight, tax evasion, and manipulated contracts. For every ton of gold Burkina Faso ships, less than 5% stays in public revenue. That's not investment. That's extraction with a passport. And this is where Nigeria's move converges with Traoré's vision. Because the mineral question is not technical. It's moral. A battery built on stolen lithium is not green. A missile guided by Burkina Faso tantalum, while Burkina Faso fights for clean water, is not defensive. The world wants Africa's minerals without Africa's agency. And now Africa is saying no in different dialects, through different leaders, but with one voice. This isn't about isolation. It's about recalibration. China is watching. So is Brazil. So is India. New trade corridors are being explored that don't begin or end in the West. And if the US doesn't adapt, not militarily, but morally, it will find itself surrounded by a continent that remembers everything and forgets nothing. Because this moment, this stand, isn't a tantrum. It's a turning away from dependency, a turning toward dignity. And in that turn lies a future where Africa is not invited, but decides. If you've ever marched for justice, if you remember Selma or Kent State, if you watched Vietnam unfold on television and asked, what are we really doing there? Then this is your moment of recognition, because what Nigeria just did and what Ibrahim Traoré continues to do is not anti-Western. It's anti-exploitation. It's the same spirit that said, no taxation without representation. The same courage that questioned COINTELPRO, that exposed Watergate, that demanded truth from power. And now Africa is asking for the same dignity, not to be saved, not to be pitied, but to be respected, to own its gold, to refine its lithium, to educate its children without waiting for a loan from the IMF. The question is not, will the West help? The question is, will it stop getting in the way, because justice isn't something you export. It's something you recognize wherever it rises. So if this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you that silence serves only the powerful, then stand with the truth, not because Africa needs your permission, but because your conscience needs its reflection. Africa is not for sale, and this time, Africa is not asking.